introduce our next two speakers, James Casey and Dr. Vanderveer. They're going to be talking to us about very, very exciting research study, MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. Dr. Vanderveer is the study physician here in Boulder and one of the sub-investigators. We're actually a husband and wife team, sub-investigator teams in that study. And James was one of our stellar participants. And James was in Afghanistan, as a medic in the Army there. He is currently a CU student studying molecular cellular developmental biology in the hopes of going to med school and researching how psychedelics affect brain development, brain chemistry. And he is also the Psychedelic Club Vice President and one of the organizers of this event. So please welcome James Casey and Dr. Vanderveer.
Afghanistan, 2011. One of my first patients was this interpreter who's riding around in a up-armored vehicle, got hit by an IED. Comes in, his femur sticking out of his thigh. He has holes all over his body. He's unconscious and choking on his own teeth. And this perfect mix of blood, shit, piss, dirt, and sweat filled the air and just made everything really real. And all I could think of as each second passed, and believe me, each second in and of itself is an eternity. But all I could think of was, why would you want to do this to somebody? I mean, he was so helpless. He was unconscious and gurgling on his own blood and teeth. But in an almost paradoxical moment, all I could think of was how bad I was wanting to do that to somebody else. Most of my family was in the military, so I grew up at a very young age realizing the importance of the freedoms and liberties this country has afforded me. And I also really enjoyed serving people. I really got something out of that a lot. So I was always, the more I grew up, I was wanting to be a doctor. And I was also wanting to serve my country because I felt like that was my duty. So how could I work that out, right? Well, I decided that I would join the military as a medic, deploy to Iraq, Afghanistan, wherever. If I come back and I still want to be a doctor, then that's a career path that I'll pursue. And that's exactly what I did. So I joined the military. I went to basic training and eventually to Afghanistan. And what can I say about Afghanistan? Not much. Because I don't want to paint myself as a hero because I'm not. And there was a lot of other people that had a lot worse off than I did. All right. But what I really do remember is the trauma. It was so real. It was so raw. And in every sense of the word, it was an experience. Now, what's an experience, right? I mean, we're having an experience right now. We have it every day. But, I mean, an experience. So it could be treating someone you know, treating a friend. People grabbing onto your shirt and begging you to let them die. Could be watching a fellow soldier do push-ups in a puddle of somebody else's own blood because they made an innocent joke. Or it could be watching someone's pupils dilate as they take their last breath. That's a priceless experience. So that changes you, safe to say. That changes some good, some bad, and a whole lot of ugly. The good gives you perspective, right? You know what's important in life, where to put your priorities. You know, I did a 4-year tour in Afghanistan, came back. I was still 19 years old. I had to wait over a year to buy beer legally. But, you know, I wasn't 19 years old in here. The bad, you know, is this, gosh, I had to pay such a sacrifice. I was on the other side of the country, or other side of the world, away from my family, away from my wife. You know, your brothers in arms, these children, all these people around you that you don't even know are dying. you know? And this one still really bothers me, but there's no milk over there. I mean, you'd think, like with all the stuff they can bring to Afghanistan, they'd at least be able to bring some like whole milk, 2%, whatever. But sometimes they have the soy milk. It was never the same. And I'll drink soy milk to this day. So anyways, once I came home, I felt like I wasn't allowed to have PTSD. You know, a lot of people in the military treat it as if it's this medal or this badge of honor to be won. My question is, who wants to win that, right? And when I came out and said that I did have PTSD, I lost a lot of friends because of that. I had one friend tell me that I was a disgrace to the uniform, and he wished they didn't serve with me. So it was difficult, and I went over a year and a half without getting any treatment. Now, when I did end up getting treatment, I was down in Fort Sam Houston, the largest medical training facility in the entire military. I did every single treatment for PTSD that the Department of Defense sponsored, besides one, which was this rapid eye movement therapy, and that didn't apply to me because I wasn't having nightmares. But I started off with the normal stuff, talking to psychologists every few weeks in between that, talking to psychiatrists, getting prescribed meds. When that didn't work, they put me in group therapy. And I would go to the hospital at 8 or 9 in the morning, leave at 3 or 4 in the afternoon for 5 days a week for 3 months. That was my job, was group therapy. And that helped while I was in it, but once I left, I had like an immediate relapse. After that, they did this thing called alpha stimulation, and it's not as scary as it sounds, but they take these electrodes, put them on your earlobes, and shoot this electrical impulse to your brain, to start getting it to work differently. That helped for issues that weren't PTSD related. Then I did hypnosis. I was really surprised the military sponsored that, and that was pretty interesting. And when that didn't work, I did this thing called prolonged exposure. And this sounds really scary and insane, but I know some good friends that actually benefited from this treatment, so I can't say too much about it. It's where they pretty much take whatever sets you off, gives you an anxiety attack, gives you an angry outburst, and puts you in those situations. And you think your anxieties just go climb and climb and climb, but it doesn't. It eventually plateaus, levels off, and drops. But that asked for a lot, and that was extremely difficult. So after doing all that stuff and nothing working, I just kind of accepted my life sentence pretty much. And I started reading this book called DMT, the Spirit Molecule by Rick Strassman, who's giving a talk at 5:30 tonight, so be sure y'all go there. I mean, to think I'd be speaking at the same event as this man 6 months ago, 3 years ago, I would not have believed you. But anyways, I started reading this book, and it got me really interested in psychedelic research about the potential out there. And inside the book, he mentions MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. So I went on their website and started, doing some searches. So I get on there, and I was looking for studies in San Antonio, where I lived at the time, or Boulder. So get on there, DMT, nothing. LSD, nothing. Psilocybin, nothing. I see MDMA, okay. And PTSD, whoa. Now, I pretty much exhausted all my options at that point. So I was thinking, what do I have to lose? It's a win-win situation. One, if it works, oh my gosh, it works. Fantastic. That's a win. And if it doesn't work, well, I'll still get to do MDMA legally. So, why not? What do I have to lose? So after doing that, I knew I had to know more. And this is where Dr. Vanderveer comes in.
Thank you, James. So I want to thank James and Nick for organizing this opportunity to spread the word on what's happening here in this world of psychedelic research, and it's an exciting time. There's a lot going on. So as mentioned before, I'm the physician on the study here in Boulder, and I want to start by giving you a little bit of background first. So I probably don't need to introduce MDMA to this group. Is everybody familiar with MDMA, more or less? Okay. So the point that I wanted to make on this slide is really just to emphasize the fact that what you can get outside of a research study is not very reliable right now, and probably hasn't been for a long time. But there are, every few months, another report or another case of somebody getting a bad batch of something and going to the hospital. And there were several college kids a few months ago who you may have read about. So I just want to really emphasize that what we're using in these trials is pure MDMA, and it's not related to what's being called ecstasy or Molly on the street. If you want to read more about that, you can go to a website called erowid.org, erowid.org. They do testing on anonymous submissions of tablets, so you can send something there and see what's in it. And usually there isn't very much MDMA, if any. So what does MDMA do? Big release of serotonin and dopamine and oxytocin. And what the serotonin and dopamine do is the dopamine actually causes increases in blood pressure and heart rate for a period of time, a few hours. And the oxytocin and serotonin give the person a lot of trust and decreasing fear, big time. So that lasts for several hours and allows people to do the work that they need to do in therapy. So PTSD, a lot of people are familiar with these statistics. 22 American veteran suicides per day currently. And that's based on a long-term study out of the VA. So that's going on right now. Lifetime incidence of 5 to 10%. That translates into about 20 to 30 million Americans at any time in their lives. PTSD treatments are not very effective. Here are the FDA-approved treatments for PTSD. They break down into medications and psychotherapies. Medications are effective maybe for some people, but when you stop the medications, the symptoms come back. So they don't actually change anything definitive, but they can suppress symptoms. And sometimes they come with a lot of side effects. Psychotherapies, a little bit more of a response than medication, but the problem with them is that they often take too long and too expensive, and there's a lot of dropout. So people don't actually make it to the end of the road. And I've met many people who have been in therapy for decades without getting the results that they need to feel functional. So here comes MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for chronic treatment-resistant PTSD. This is something that wasn't on my radar 3 or 4 years ago. I've treated PTSD for my whole career, and it's a big focus for me. And, frankly, my tools are not very effective, and I have pretty good tools. So when I read this study that came out in 2010, I'm going to share that data with you. I got interested in it. And the principal investigator of our study, Marcelo Talora, called me and asked me if I wanted to participate in the study. So what we've studied here in Boulder is not only military PTSD, but PTSD from any cause. We're sponsored by the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS. And this is a phase 2 double-blind randomized clinical trial. So it's a FDA-approved, DEA-approved effort to show the safety and efficacy of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. And we're just one of several sites around the world that are doing this work. So in order to participate in the study, first of all, you have to meet inclusion and exclusion criteria. So we're careful about making sure that if a person has a past history of psychosis or bipolar disorder, we don't bring them into the study for reasons of safety. Person has to have chronic treatment-resistant PTSD, so they have to have tried and failed multiple efforts to address their symptoms and have ongoing symptoms. And then we perform a physical exam, do blood work, EKG, and taper medications. So people are not allowed to continue medications through the trial. The study design is a randomized, double-blinded, comparator dose-controlled crossover design. So basically what that means is that the investigators and the participants and all the raters, statisticians and so forth, are blinded to which condition the participant received. And if you are a participant who is randomized to the comparator dose, which is basically like a placebo, but an active placebo, you have to go through 2 sessions with the active placebo, and then you get an opportunity to circle around and have 3 full-dose MDMA sessions. And that's part of the ethics of this trial, is we felt that it would be unethical to have people come in and get a comparator dose and then send them home and not afford them the opportunity to have the full-dose MDMA sessions. We also felt that a sugar pill placebo probably wouldn't be a very good blind, so it wouldn't really trick people into not knowing whether they got MDMA or not. Most people can tell if their consciousness is altered or not. So we used a low-dose comparator, which has worked pretty well as far as the blinding goes so far. So all people get 3 full-dose, all-day MDMA sessions with a male and female therapist in the room for the whole day. They spend the night at the site. They have another session in the morning. And we have several preparation sessions and integration sessions before and after the MDMA all-day session. And we haven't had any cases of hyperthermia or deaths in over 700 people who have taken MDMA in these pooled data. So this is a list of different studies and different amounts of participants. I just want to make it really clear that we're still talking about phase 2 clinical trials, which means small studies, usually with ends in the 20s, in the neighborhood of 20 or 25 people. So what I'm going to show you today is preliminary data. Preliminary in the sense that it's phase 2 data, but also, even more importantly, for our Boulder study, we're not even finished with the study yet. So we have to be really careful about how we interpret the information that I'm going to present to you today. The Boulder study will be finished by about December of this year. It's been going on for 3 years. And here is a piece of the results from the 2010 MDMA trial that happened in Charleston, South Carolina. Michael Methofer and his colleagues. I wanted to show you that the dotted line is they actually had a sugar pill placebo in this trial. And this is the rating scale that we use to determine how severe the PTSD symptoms are. It's called the clinician-administered PTSD scale. The scale goes from 0 to 130 for a maximum score. And a score below 50 is considered to be remission from PTSD. So what they achieved in this trial was, starting at about 77 was their beginning point on average. For the placebo, they achieved about a 20-point drop. And for the active arm of the study, they got from 77 down to about 43. So what is that, 30, something like 30 or 40-point drop, which was it was a statistically significant result. Okay, I think I'm going to take a break and hand over the mic to James. Thanks for being here.
So once I decided I was wanting to do this study, or at least attempt to get inside of it, I thought I'd have at least some support, and I didn't have much. I mentioned the MDMA study to one of my military doctors, and she completely ignored me like I didn't even say anything at all. Once I got out of the military, I mentioned it to one of my doctors here in Colorado, and she dropped me as a patient. My wife wasn't very supportive whatsoever. Thought it She thought it was just some drug I was wanting to do. And I invited my mother and my father to my first session, and my mother flat out refused. She wouldn't be a part of it. So that was difficult. I was going through a lot of turmoil at that time, just to name a few things. I was emotionally numb, hypervigilant. I had this anxiety where loud noises, fireworks, what have you, would just give me this panic attack. And I didn't have a flashback. I didn't think I was being shot at or anything, but every time I'd hear that pop from that firework, these mangled bodies would take over my vision. And I had this anger problem. It was just like someone could say something, I'd be happy, and it's a flick of a switch, 0 to 60 immediately, and I was furious. It's like my consciousness or something would take a step back in my head, and I'd just watch the rage take over. It was much like a Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde scenario. And just to explain to you how bad this is, so when I got back from Afghanistan, I got a puppy, named her Dash. Thought it helped me out with my issues. But it had the exact opposite effect. I'd kick her against the wall. I'd throw her on the ground. I would choke her until I would see her eyes roll in the back of her skull, and I'd let go. I would fantasize about killing her and make it look like an accident so my wife wouldn't know I did it. As if taking MDMA in a clinical setting is worse than that. So there's a lot to say, and not much time. The session was like years and years of therapy. In one session, there were 3 of them. So I got to leave a lot out. But I will say 2 things. One, each session played its own instrumental role in getting me better. And I like to name each one. So the first one was identifying the problem, what I was facing once I got back from Afghanistan. The second one was, if so, so what? And finally, the third was being able to feel again. And the second thing I want to say is each MDMA, or any MDMA session was an experience. All right? Now, I'd go in, lay down on this couch, put this blindfold on, and take the medicine. And I'd start verbalizing what I was experiencing. Now, the therapist didn't interrogate me. They didn't lead the session. They asked more questions of curiosity than anything. And they let me find the answers. So an example of that, I mentioned a couple times I was emotionally numb. I knew I loved my wife with all my heart. I just knew it, but I couldn't feel it. I knew I loved my mother and my father dearly, but I couldn't feel it. During the sessions, I realized there was this wall around my heart. And when I was a kid, I could easily jump over it and experience emotions and express myself and what have you. But after Afghanistan, it was just like all these bricks were added. And for any of y'all that have seen Game of Thrones, the wall, that's what it was like. It just extended out of my field of view. And it was like I developed this form of Stockholm syndrome with it. It was with me for so long that I kind of sympathized with it. I was convinced myself it was there to help me and protect me when its intentions didn't have me in mind at all. And then that's when the therapist started asking questions. So you get to that point without them leading you into that. It's really interesting stuff, and that brings some really, you really get to dive deep into that trauma. And my dad was there during that session. I mentioned my mother didn't come, but my father did. And I experienced a lot of things that changed me that day. And he experienced a lot of things that changed him that day. And the next day, he talked to my mother, talked to my wife, and all of a sudden my mom was a little bit more supportive. My wife agreed to come to the second session, which was fantastic. During the second session, so I identified the problem, that emotional numbness, the wall, right? So what? So during the second session, I realized that when I was in Afghanistan, I was always trying to bring the positive back with me, Seeing people blown up, treating people that are dying, like all this stuff. It's really easy to take the negative with you. So I tried to take some positive. But I felt really betrayed when so much of the negative came back. I felt so weak for bringing back the PTSD. And every time someone tried to show me some love, kindness, compassion, I felt this intense feeling of disgust. And just so you can understand how disgusted I felt, for any of you that's seen The Lost World, the one with Jeff Goldblum, there's this T-Rex chasing these people through the forest in the film. And they end up hiding under this waterfall, and the T-Rex can't get in there. But he sticks his mouth up to it, and he sticks his long, slimy tongue in there, and it starts going past the people. And the tongue just goes up out of someone's face. Now imagine what that would feel like. And that's what it felt like every time someone tried to love me and show me compassion. And and I kind of perceived that weakness, I felt that love. So every time I felt that love, I didn't want to feel it. So that's why I became numb, because it's a whole lot easier to do that than constantly feel that T-Rex lick, right? And during the sessions, I was thinking about Superman and him being tied up in these kryptonite ropes, And kryptonite's his weakness, and it's physically impossible for him to get out. Just like it was physically impossible for me to show and express love. And I started to realize all these people helping me, or trying to help me for that matter, were like just regular Joe Schmoes coming up and trying to untie the ropes for Superman. They're not affected by kryptonite. But Superman was stubborn, wouldn't let him do it, thought he had to do it himself. And I was stubborn. I wouldn't let anyone do anything. I thought I had to do it myself. So, it was a nice thought to, be like, I can just let these people untie these ropes for me, let them help me out. That's a great thought. But that would still mean that I'd have to go through that T-Rex lick. And it's uncomfortable even thinking about it. Then during the third session, I noticed the tightness in my muscles was gone. I was actually able to feel some things. And I started to realize that, this MDMA is such a great treatment for PTSD. I mean, you have love coming out of every cell of your body. I'm not talking about physical ecstasy, all right? I'm talking about love. And it was like these plates of armor I could put all over my body and dive into the darkness of the PTSD and come out unscathed. And, a big takeaway, and this is just kind of to solve one problem, but each solution I had for my problems required the simplest answer you could think of. I kept trying to be the James I was before deployment. So going into every treatment, that's what I try to be like. I used to like fireworks, so it makes sense that if I was cured of PTSD, I'd like fireworks, right? Doesn't that make sense? So I would keep holding myself to that standard. Okay, I gotta like fireworks, gotta like fireworks, gotta like fireworks. And I kept getting disappointed. And just realizing, and I finally came to the realization, I don't have to light fireworks. That's it. That's all it was. And I can just be the James I am after deployment. I don't have to light fireworks. And it's kind of like a math problem, right? You can look at a math problem, not know the answer to it, flip to the back of the book, look at the answer. But you're still no closer than you were before, because how are you going to get that answer, right? The answer is not the answer. You got to work the math problem out. You got to know how you get that answer. And the journey is the solution. And it's like that with a lot of things. If someone has public anxiety, they have fear talking to people, they already know the answer, to talk to people. But they got to process that. They got to work through that themselves. And that's what each session was like. And it really pains me to know that these things are Schedule 1, that the government's not letting all these people take it. I mean, 22 a day now. Granted, not all that's PTSD, but even if it's 1 a day from PTSD, that's too much. Just veterans or everybody else that suffers from this. It's really a tragedy that we just don't have access to these medicines in a timely manner. But I'm about to hand it off to Dr. Vanderveer, but before I do, I'd like to say one last thing. So, this may seem a little bit off topic, but it'll make sense. So earlier this summer, I had a job interview with the best roofing company in Denver, Northwest Roofing. And I was going in ultimately for a sales position to go sell some roofs. And the owner of the company asked me, goes, James, what sales experience do you have? None whatsoever. But I'm vice president of the Psychedelic Club at CU Boulder. That was his response too. So I say, well, hold on a sec. You know, in that club, the whole point of it is to influence people and to try to get them to shift their perspective on Schedule I substances that have been heavily stigmatized since the 1960s. If I can do that, I can sell a roof. You know? But the reason I say that is, you know, this talk's being recorded. And the owner of that company wants a copy of this video. So if there's anything that I've said today, Dr. Vanderveer said today, that has resonated with you, done just that, at the end of this talk, please let us know in the form of applause and yelling and clapping, whatever, so the owner of that company knows. All right? And I can go sell roofs next summer. So here I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Vanderveer.
Thanks. All right. Hard act to follow. Thanks, James. So I wanted to pick up where maybe where James left us and talk a little bit more about the preliminary results from our study here in Boulder. And I want to start by just pointing out here something that I didn't mention about this slide right here, that I had said that below 50 is not PTSD anymore. So one of the remarkable things about this previous phase 2 clinical trial was that 83% of the participants who came in with, they all came in with chronic treatment-resistant PTSD. 83% didn't meet criteria for PTSD anymore after only 3 MDMA sessions. So what does that say? So here is a compilation of the results of different phase 2 trials. And the statistic here is effect size over here in this column. And you can see these are different protocols, 125 versus 0. This is the Mithofer study on the previous slide, 125 versus 25. I think this is the Swiss study. And then another trial out of Charleston here. And these are 2 different ways to analyze the data in the Boulder study with preliminary data. So effect size is a nice way to, you're probably familiar with p-values and significance studies. This is another way to look at whether the condition of the participant at the end is attributable to the intervention or not. So a large effect size is more compelling in terms of whether the intervention was actually the reason why the data changed. So outside of a couple weeks ago at Burning Man, where Rick Doblin presented these slides, and this is the first time that we're showing preliminary data from this Boulder study. So just again to be aware, this is preliminary data. The study's not finished yet. These gold and red lines are the active dose arm. We're calling them active 1 and active 2 to maintain the blinding since we're still midstream in our, well, near the end of our trial. And this is our low dose comparator arm. So just to walk you through this, we're starting with participants with a CAP score of roughly about 90 on average. And we're seeing drops after 2 sessions that are pretty significant here. And we're still compiling the longer term data. So that's how things look so far in Boulder. And these are blood pressure and temperature data. again for Boulder. And I just put this up here because, you know, people do get concerned in raves and party situations about hyperthermia, transient side effects that can happen during a clinical experience of MDMA. So this is the upper number of blood pressure, systolic. This is the lower. You can see that there are mild elevations. It's interesting to see that with the 40 milligram dose, comparator dose, you also see an elevation. Not so much in the diastolic. So these are changes in blood pressure that are consistent with a workout, basically. Nothing major. Temperature, kind of a similar thing. Nothing significant to report there. So what's next? We plan on being finished here in phase 2, December of this year. We're already in planning phases for the phase 3 clinical trial. Phase 3 means 20 sites, 400 participants. It's the last step before applying for FDA approval to make MDMA psychotherapy a prescription treatment for PTSD. And that's a long study, so it'll take a few years to complete. And here's a couple of websites where you can learn more if you're interested in reading more about what we're up to in the world of MAPS studies for medical applications for psychedelics. Okay, I think I'll leave it at that, and we have some, we're going to take some questions, right, James? Should we pass this mic around?
Yeah. I don't need a mic. Jewish. Grab Max from outside.
Okay.
To record the questions with the mic, though? We do it that way?
So, what's going on?
Do you want? Sorry.
Yeah, it's fine.
Oh, we were.
Oh, yeah, come on. Bring up a chair. So, well, I guess while they're getting Max, anyone have any questions for Dr. Vanderveer or I about any of this MDMA stuff? What's up, Evan?
What is the length of time between each session? How does that length of time compare to the time it takes for tolerance of MDMA?
Was the second part about tolerance to reset? So the protocol requires us to space out the sessions anywhere from minimum of 3 weeks to maximum of 5 weeks. So it ends up being about a month on average, usually 4 weeks. And when we're prescribing MDMA for psychotherapy 3 times, or if the person's randomized to a comparator and they get 2 low dose and then 3 full dose, we're not really seeing issues with tolerance per se. Certainly there are transient side effects that people go through, and there can be some after effects like headaches and things like that that they need to work through, but usually that goes away pretty quickly. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Cool, thanks.
What psychotherapeutic methods are being implemented during these sessions?
That's a great question. So thanks for asking that. I meant to mention that. Yeah. So the question is, what psychotherapeutic method are we using? So the protocol is designed to include primarily, is based off of Stan Grof's work with holotropic breath work. If you're not familiar with that work, basically it's a client-focused approach where the role of the therapist is really different from other therapy techniques. And basically what the job of the therapist to do is to redirect the person to find their own inner wisdom or their own inner healer. And so with the help of the MDMA on board, that tends to be a pretty potent way to work with it, to work with trauma. And it's a nice way. I found that it's a really nice way to work with people with MDMA because it's so empowering for the participants. So it's not really a interpretation-based or, therapist-based approach. The other influence is from the work called Internal Family Systems of Richard Schwartz. Is that right, Sandra? David Schwartz? Okay. And he's out of Chicago, and basically his contribution was that when people are traumatized, then parts of their selves get fragmented. And so what we find happens a lot in the sessions is people under the influence of the MDMA kind of automatically go into going into finding parts that were disavowed or hidden, especially people with a lot of early childhood trauma. We have a fair amount of that in our study. So that can be really powerful to bring the parts together that have been disconnected from each other. So we're not using any of the approved psychotherapies for PTSD like EMDR or cognitive behavioral therapy or exposure therapy.
Let's take turns with questions for us and for Andrew Livingston, Max Montrose, and Daniel McQueen. So anyone have any questions for them real quick? Oh, okay. Go ahead, man. Well, I think a big problem was that how do I put this? I thought a lot of what I didn't have anymore, I lost it, So a lot of it wasn't, it was, so I thought I lost my sense of feeling. I thought I lost the being able to control my anger, all these other things, because like I said, I tried every single treatment, so why did I think I could do anything? And I'm a big proponent of personal responsibility, so I always make those decisions. And if I was wanting to change my, the ways I acted, then I would take responsibility for that. But, so I thought I lost all that stuff. And it was just really kind of reclaiming what was never lost. There seemed to be this darkness that really took control of me. And I didn't mention this in my talk, I wish I did, but it was like there was this blanket of darkness, the ugly, right? The ugly would put this blanket of darkness over all the good to where I thought it wasn't there anymore, to where I thought I couldn't access it. And it was just really a process of uncovering that blanket and realizing that, darkness is just a part of life, like night follows day, and it's just there. I just got to grow up and not be afraid of the dark anymore. So I hope that answers your question a little bit. Dr. Vanderveer?
Are there any data on how permanent the effects of this?
That's a good question. You can read about that on mdmaptsd.org. There was a long-term follow-up study from the 2010 study that I presented, the data from that. On average, it was 39 months for follow-up, so a little over 3 years. And the results were essentially durable over that period of time. We plan on doing a long-term follow-up study here as well.
Question for Max, Andrew, Daniel?
Yeah, there's so very good question. And within the cannabis industry, we've made up our own language. And there's lots of words we've decided to stop using because we're coming from a black market to a white market, and we need that to be more socially acceptable. So we no longer call it earwax. We call it wax. You really don't see strains on the store shelf anymore that says, Alaskan Thunderfuck. You still see Durban Poison and things like that, but we don't even like saying the word recreational. We say adult use. It's not recreation. You're an adult and you're using cannabis. That's it. In my company, we have a policy you're not allowed to use the word marijuana because it's derogatory. We say cannabis. And so we are trying in the cannabis community really hard to restructure and shape which words we use because we do believe that's important.
Yeah, I would say it's almost important to keep the word spiritual there, right? Because when we start changing our language in order to fit the current state of reality, we're doing ourselves a disservice, because what we actually have to change is our current state of how we're looking at this, right? And I mentioned this a little bit on the talk, and I think one of the most difficult things is that in the United States, this is less the case in other cultures, but particularly in Western culture, we have divisions between substances that are taken for enjoyment and substances that are taken for healing. But I think that there's not all that much of a difference between there. And I'll share a little very short story. So an intern that I had this summer, who was finishing his PhD at Rand, told me a trope that a researcher had said during a presentation at an international drug policy conference in Italy. This was an Egyptian researcher. And she asked, how many people use cannabis medically? Some people raised their hands, some people didn't. How many people use marijuana recreationally? Some people raised their hand, some didn't. Do you use marijuana to feel good? Do you use marijuana to feel better? And I think the tiny amount of distinction, if there is any, between feeling good and feeling better kind of represents the fact that there isn't categories when it comes to physical wellness, spiritual wellness, psychological wellness. It's a gradient, and it's probably a three-dimensional gradient in which you have to improving one improves the other. As James was saying, his muscles started to physically unclench, and that's what your physical body is reacting. Because our brains are physical, right? So the connections that were gained there is changing, lots of things in your body. So when we're talking about spirituality, I think it's about connecting people with the important. Because there's a lot of people in the United States that are very spiritual, right? And they'll recognize that spirituality and how that has helped them physically. So as long as we're almost speaking the languages of where they're at now, we can educate them into understanding that psychedelics are just a tool, in the same way that going to church and the community on that side, as well as chanting or speaking in tongues or however anyone likes to do to seek that state, that can be done. So I think it's more so getting people from where they're at, but not changing our language just because we're afraid of it.
I just want to add my opinion real quick, take 5 seconds. And I would be very careful with that too, because, we got the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, and we have a freedom of religion. We got freedom of speech. So, you don't want to change your words too much to where you're not covered under your inalienable rights, which is what the war on drugs is doing anyways, is taking those away. So. And you'll be next.
I just want to say something also about James's experience, and how utterly profound it is to hear his story, and that the recovery and the healing that happened. I heard some of his stories for the first time when we were doing harm reduction at Arise, and some of these stories are so extreme that they make people dissociate just hearing the story about what happened. And this is a young man that lived through it. and healed from it. And he's one of my primary inspirations for this work. So it's a tragedy, and it's possibly even criminal that this medicine's not available. And so a lot of people are taking it in their own hands and trying to do this work on their own. Like, why wouldn't you want to do this if you had PTSD and it wasn't accessible? So why wouldn't you try to do it on your own? And I just want to say, from a harm reduction perspective, that set and setting's often not enough in a clinical situation like this, and that there are skill sets and trainings that you can do to better assist you in that. So I would really encourage you to think before you just pop a pill. Get the medicine tested, because like Will was saying, they're using pure MDMA. There's no MDMA in the pills these days, or very little, if any. There are other medicines, so you're not going to have the same experience. And then when you do pop that trauma and you do relive that experience, if you're alone or you're with someone who can't handle it, it can be very damaging. And we have clients in our practice that have tried to do it on their own, and we help them through that process of even recovering from trying to do it on their own. So again, as a harm reduction perspective, I'll acknowledge that you're probably going to some of you might try to do this. So please bring some awareness to it and some skill into your practice, and at the very least, have a therapist on the side that you can talk to about your experiences. So this is extremely powerful work, and I just wanted to really honor James and the speech he gave. That was, I don't know what to say about that. I'm just deeply inspired. So I just wanted to name that piece. Be safe if you try to do something like this.
And really quick question, because we got to go. So.
That question comes up a lot with participants who read about MDMA online and, how to protect your brain. And we decided that because that information is anecdotal, that it wouldn't really be something that we could support in an FDA trial. If there were big studies showing that taking 5-HTP afterward really helped, or, if other supplements were necessary to make it safe, then I think it would be part of the protocol. So the answer is no, it's not part of the protocol. And I will say that, I don't know much about recreational sort of non-clinical use of MDMA, but we do see side effects during the session. But I think, to Daniel's point about impurities, I think some experiences people have using, quote, MDMA, unquote, outside of a clinical setting that they think are side effects of MDMA might not be secondary to MDMA per se. So I think there are differences there too that can be pretty dangerous, actually, for people. So I echo his caution. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.